Welcome back to this third episode of Rittener Reflections. Today, I offer my reflections about this incredibly challenging moment in our history regarding cross-border trade. And then I will share with you an amazing conversation I had with someone whom I admire and who has spent more than 40 years immersed in the ever-changing world of global trade. But first, let me go back to the last episode published on the eve of the U.S. presidential inauguration. Over the last 2 weeks, we have witnessed the president take swift and sweeping actions that he promised during his campaign, some of which include issuing hundreds of executive orders, deporting thousands of undocumented individuals, dismissing hundreds of government employees from their current role or job, and impacting millions of dollars from cross-border trade by imposing tariffs on Canada, China, Colombia, and Mexico. I am still trying to keep up with the relentless pace of change, grasp the significance of each action, and manage my overwhelming sense of uncertainty for the future. Like so many of you, I am bracing myself for the tariff wars, which have begun in earnest this past weekend. I have seen this movie before, but not on this scale. I offer my initial thoughts today and plan to devote an entire episode soon. During the first Trump administration, I was leading our global trade organization and suddenly forced to shift the team's focus from not only compliance and product movement across borders, but to finance and supply chain mitigation. The duties levied against China under Section 301 had significant impact on our global supply chain operations and the bottom line. The first challenge was to determine the potential monetary impact. Up to this point, most products we brought back into the United States from China were duty-free, and supply chain decisions were made accordingly. With this sudden change, we embarked on a journey to scrutinize every part of our business involving China to better understand the financial implications to a supply chain that was developed under a zero-duty environment. After a challenging period of discovery, we moved into mitigation strategies. We identified pertinent solutions and pursued them in parallel. First, with dollars at stake, we performed a detailed review of our HTS classification to ensure accuracy. Second, where possible, we submitted tariff exclusion requests. Third, we performed a comprehensive analysis of potential supply chain changes. And finally, we created foreign trade zones where applicable. I am painfully aware of what you may be going through at this time, and I encourage you to be patient, vigilant, leave no stone unturned, and be mindful that you will find opportunities to improve your business through this unexpected work. Moving on, I remind you that one of the things that you can be certain of in 2025 is a re-energized and focused enforcement of regulations and trade compliance programs. This will lead to more scrutiny, potential fines and penalties, and requires traders to assess their compliance programs. You can no longer cut corners and rely on old practices, but must prioritize compliance across the entire organization. As such, I am devoting the remainder of this episode to unpacking this certainty as it carries significant risk for trade organizations. Without robust and effective compliance programs, you could create potential hardship and negative publicity for you or your company. Consequently, I am extremely excited to share with you an enjoyable conversation I recorded earlier today with Karen Murphy, who has more than 40 years experience effectively managing compliance programs across a wide range of companies in the technology industry. Thank you for joining me today for Rittener Reflections. I am visiting with Karen Murphy on a very beautiful day here in Discovery Bay, California. Karen is an expert in the field of global trade operations. Currently, she is advising companies on reducing risks in global trade processes, developing organizations to support a complex regulatory environment, and analyzing automation solutions to transform the global trade function. She previously was the Vice President of Business Consulting Services at Archlink, where she bridged the communications between IT and global trade. Prior to that, she was Vice President at Flextronics, and before that, she spent time at Applied Materials. She is a past member of the President's Export Council's Subcommittee on Export Administration, PEXIA, and is a current member of the Regulations and Procedures Technical Advisory Committee, RAPTAC, for the Bureau of Industry and Security, where we both serve. Welcome to Rittener Reflections. Thank you for joining me today. I wanted to start by sharing with our listeners the fact that you and I have known each other for an extraordinarily long time, as we have often crossed paths on our own trade journeys. However, the other day, as we prepared for this conversation, we discovered some new things that we have in common. For example, both you and I grew up in Cupertino, California. Back when a majority of Cupertino were fruit orchards, this was before the creation of a fruit company that we all know. We also went to different high schools, but we lived no more than 2 miles apart. And we both started our trade careers working for companies that made floppy disks back when they were export controlled. So much has happened since then. Having both lived our entire lives in the Silicon Valley, we were able to witness amazing transformation from what was known as a farming agricultural community to the center of tech innovation. As for you, Karen, could you maybe share with us a little bit about yourself? How did you get started in global trade and why? And any career highlights or memorable moments that you would like to share with the audience.
Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me to your reflections. When I was first listening to the first two, I thought, oh, this could be really fun. So I'm excited to be here today and to host you at my home. So I started out way back where my father is a civil engineer in the Bay Area, and he did a lot of work for some very famous clients. One of them included Steve Jobs. And my dad told me, you should get a job at this kid's company. So I had taken a course on how to fill out an export license, and from there it's kind of history. I then went on to work at a customs broker, freight forwarder up at the airport, where I handled all different types of products and projects, including major rock concerts in the day, posters, t-shirts, all that kind of stuff. So it's been a lot of fun, and just looking forward to figuring out what, yes, the next 4 years, but maybe even smaller than that, the next year is going to be, in partnering with companies to get through the complexity.
I wanted to share with you a story of when I first met you. I don't think I've ever told you this one before, but I remember the day very well, as it was my birthday. And I was in transition between jobs. The floppy disk company that I worked for was acquired, it was consolidated, and my job was eliminated. So I was looking for work. And I was supposed to go out for dinner that evening for my birthday, and someone told me that there was a PAEI end of the year holiday party. It was probably the second or third annual party. PAEI, just for those to know, is the Professional Associations of Exporter and Importers. And I went there because I was told that they often advertise jobs. So I should go. So I went, and apart from meeting Cindy Sholakey, who I think was the founder, I met you and George Tuttle, the younger. Junior. And you two were up on the stage and you were in charge. You guys had such a great program and it left such an impression on me. I was just so impressed. And the good news is they announced 2 positions at Intel, one of which I interviewed for, and within a week I got the job, which started my 34-year career at Intel. So Karen, thank you for hosting that a very important event.
Wow, I didn't know that you were also one of my flowers. I have several people in the industry where I've told them to go to a meeting, go to a presentation, work the room. And in fact, I believe that your team at Intel had hired 2 or 3 of my flowers due to going to a Women in International Trade meeting, a PAI meeting or something where I said, just go, get out of your house and meet people. And so I didn't know. I'll have to add you to my list.
It's good to be one of your flowers.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about compliance and enforcement. You know, we are entering a period, and maybe we're already there, of incredible uncertainty. And I am just amazed at what has already happened in the last 2 weeks. And amid this uncertainty, I have shared with listeners that there are some things that are certain. And when it comes to cross-border trade, and one of those is the certainty that governments will step up their enforcement efforts on trade, looking at compliance to regulations, and there will be more scrutiny on compliance programs. So, with that in mind, where do you see the biggest risk for enforcement actions, and what areas of compliance programs do you think governments are going to kind of focus on?
Yeah, so recently I've seen a trend to delay or block shipments in or out of China, whether it's coming in and they're looking at forced labor, potential involvement in a particular import, or it's an export to China of what the customs authorities who administer the export regulations believe that could be a risk to national security. I'm not going to even talk about international traffic in arms or anything, but traditional shipments of very legitimate commercial products going in or out of the U.S., in or out of China, are definitely being looked at. And I think that companies have to really focus their compliance policies, procedures around prevention of that happening to them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do they do that? It can be automating everything else and focusing on what could be a high chance of delay or disruption in their supply chain, and having the trade professionals work on those kinds of activities with supply chain, with manufacturing. That's where I would put my most effort is shipments in or out of China. Most high-tech companies have pretty much divested with Russia, and Belarus. Those sanctions have been going on slowly but surely for several years. But I think China has really hit us all very hard because a huge part of the supply chain is China.
Mm-hmm. That is true. That is very true. So with that in mind, many of the focus areas that I recall in trade was around knowing your customer. And can you offer any thoughts on how companies in this kind of environment should focus on knowing your customer?
It should be noted that the entity list is just a list of companies that have not been convicted of any crime nor any detailed investigation brought forth the allegations that these are a high-risk customer. So what do companies end up doing? They're doing a lot of the work to analyze their business partners. And it is a major focus area because each entity that's listed has different restrictions around what can or cannot be done. I know that a lot of compliance programs say in their policy that they won't do business with any entity or any business partner who is on any government sanction list. that's probably something that companies need to look at and maybe change it to say the company will comply with the requirements of any government who is controlling technology to certain business partners for specific reasons. Because there is some flexibility on what you can or cannot do with the entities on all of the US government lists, but it's getting more and more complex.
I think that's probably the word of the day is complex, because if you look at the last 3 or 4 years and the number of rules that have been published, whether they're rules on technology that can be transferred, whether they're rules on who you can do business, where, it's just becoming more and more complex. One of the things that I often promoted at my company was to take our compliance program and, rather than it being the minimum necessary to comply, to turn it into a strategic force, if you will. And so I don't know, do you have any thoughts or experience on how to turn your compliance program from this sort of, but we have to do this, to really how it becomes beneficial to the company?
Yes, I think the team needs to be known as a business enabler, not a roadblock, or not like a necessary evil. Companies talk about the tax department in a similar genre. We won't pay any taxes. But, global trade needs to really come forth with ideas and problem solving, not be the Department of No, N-O, but be the Department of Know, K-N-O-W. That's the key to really becoming a function that's looked at as a business partner within the company.
No, I love that. I love that point and that story. I'll tell one, speaking of tax, we used to, for 20 some odd years, report to the tax department. And when I would go to meet with the CFO on trade issues, she would look at me and say, "I don't want to see the hand." And she goes, "I like working with you because you get shit done." And so I think that's a really good point you make. As we think about, good compliance programs, can you share any stories from your experience where you have actually had to present your compliance program to the enforcement community, whether that was OEE or CBP?
Yeah, I think, again, whenever there's a question from an authority, and I don't even want to use the term like investigation. I'd rather call it more of a question. Partnering and providing the information and explaining what maybe their concerns are, and not being confrontational, not lawyering up, with like all different external lawyers and all that. I think you still need their advice and help, but to understand what the risk was that a government agency is perceiving is at your company, you might learn something too. I've had to pay fines and penalties before at different companies. I haven't had anything severe like a suspension or revocation, but sometimes having that different lens on a process or a transaction can be a positive experience. But the minute either party gets confrontational, it never ends well.
And how, in those situations, how did you manage upward to your superiors?
So the big thing that the superiors want to know is, what is the financial risk? How much should we reserve for? What is, how much are we going to pay? And a lot of times, you can write a check and then everybody goes away. But on the other hand, in more serious situations, you're going to have to upgrade your compliance program and processes. You might have to do some different automation solutions to be able to prevent the particular event from occurring again. So I think that working upwards, you've got to be ready with those answers that they're going to expect. And then the financial folks can decide if there really is a risk of that magnitude They can disclose it during earnings calls if they feel they need to, but for them to have the information is the most important.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. The dollar impact is that bullet they want to see. And we as compliance professionals tend to want to give them all the details of how we got there. But what they really care about, as you said, was what's the bottom line? What's that impact that we're going to have to?
And just one more thought on that. If it's something to do with customs and you didn't pay the right duty, that was what was due anyway, right? You should have paid it correctly the first time. Then there's fines and penalties, which can be added to that, but realistically, that number is not necessarily huge, as people tend to over-exaggerate sometimes to scare people.
Right.
And I don't believe in that either. Be honest.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. I'll share with you very, very quickly, since we both were in the floppy disk business. And for those in the audience that may not know what a floppy disk, it's a small little piece of media that you use to put in a mainframe computer and to store all your data. But anyway, I remember working for this company. When I arrived, they had filed a voluntary self-disclosure. And if you can imagine the millions and billions of disks that went around the world, and they were tracking all those on IVLs, on individual licenses. And so they overshipped, they didn't keep accurate records, and so they filed a disclosure. Well, it languished at the Department of Commerce for 5 years. And 1 month before the statute of limitations, they decided to look at it. So I got a call from the Office of Export Enforcement, and the enforcement agent said, I'm going to come out. I'd like to go look at your files. Will you be willing to meet with me next week? I said, sure. So next week I was all ready. I was sweating. He's coming. He comes in. It's his first case. He's from Texas. And he comes in and he sits down on the table and he pulls his gun out and puts it on the table and says, okay, let's look at those files. And this is on floppy disks. Anyway, that's my first engagement with the Office of Export Enforcement. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit, because both of us, I think when we think of compliance, we know how important a good system is. And can you describe your experience with trade systems? It sounds like in your background you've worked a lot with IT and trade systems.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of different things, going way back to one of the first solutions, which was on floppy disk, EMS 2000.
Oh, yes.
And then moving into what I kind of call the big systems like Oracle, Global Trade Management, SAP, Global Trade System or Solution. But there's a lot in between, E2 Open or Amber Road, MCI. There's many different ways that companies can address some of the compliance processes in a more automated way. I don't really have a favorite or a recommendation for anyone who might be listening. It's more, what is your volume? How complex are your customers and your products? And even more importantly, can the system eloquently get the data in or out of the ERP, the warehouse and transportation? Those are the real questions. All of the systems can be configured and built to produce an export declaration, invoice, all the paperwork that you need, and do the screening. Again, the screening algorithm needs to be looked at all the time, and the license decision process has to be looked at consistently, especially in the wake of all these new regulations that, depending on the company, depending on the address of the company, you can do certain things and you can't do certain things. That is going to be a big challenge for these systems to be configured correctly to come up with the answer. Nothing is lights out anymore. You're gonna have to have supervised either the use of, people are touting AI to do some of the activities, but you really have to have a professional, a trade person who understands both business partners and the products to be able to help get the shipment out.
Right. So in your experience in the various roles that you've played, how did you work with IT? Was IT part of the trade organization? Was it separate? How did you manage that?
So depending where I was, we had like, and my current engagement right now, we have a couple technical people that when there's a request to make a fix to the system, they do that work. And they work with the trade subject matter experts to test it and implement whatever fix might be needed. At other companies, we were using like a cloud provider, so we had to put in a ticket to that company, and they had to make the change at their location, and then some of the global trade folks would test it and make sure it did what we needed to be done. So it's kind of been all over the board, working with different solutions to achieve specific goals, again, depending on the complexity and the risk at the companies.
Right, I see. So given we've talked a lot about how complex regulations are becoming, and I think both you and I know that when it comes to systems, they're big, they're complex as well, and they're hard sometimes to adjust and to enhance. So can you help us understand how did you work within the company to ensure that the system stayed current with all the changing rules and regulations? So were there certain things that you did you have to move to manual processes? Were you able to adjust those in the system? And just curious how you managed this kind of situation.
Yeah, so I think that you have to kind of look at the risk analysis and set a goal of, like, I used to constantly measure how many parts we had classified, for example, against what was being ordered and demanded coming in. But then at the same time, we would be eliminating products or retiring them. So I never got above like 70% of the bucket was classified. So I think you have to do the same thing with the complexity of the regulations. You have to kind of pick a target with respect to the amount of transactions and business partners and anything else that needs to be done, and decide what is your goal for automation. And then everything else might be a hybrid. Mm-hmm. It might be that you block certain transactions and work on them manually, and then once they're able to go through this system, then they get pushed over manually. There's a lot going on right now with the regulations, and I think you have to set your goals for automation and then start working towards them, but not risk compliance.
Right, and that's a big challenge to balance that, as you said. Today everybody is talking about AI. There is AI. Everybody's advertising they have AI on everything. So let's talk about AI and compliance.
Okay.
How do you think we can use AI to improve our compliance programs and our systems?
Yes, so when I was at ArchLink, we had a tool that was available to our clients to use to manage their classifications, and for all sorts of data points, not just HTS and ECCNs. In my mind, again, you set the goal of what can AI give a reasonable confidence level to, and maybe you go ahead and let those products go. Like, we had a customer who manufactured sticky notes, but they kept having challenges with different colors, different sizes. And once we figured out the algorithm, the AI could definitely classify with a 90%, 95% confidence. There's no need for a person to look at that again. But then on the other hand, you could have kits and sets and things that require a little bit more training of an algorithm. So you have to really look at AI as being another team member and using it as a tool in your toolbox, but then constantly monitoring the recommendations that the AI gives you and where it may have gone wrong or where it may have learned something. But you can't just lights out trade, especially around export classifications and even customs classifications, depending on, well, now everything's dutiable, so.
Right. Well, it's interesting because we had a person who was an IT person that specialized in AI, And so we hired him into the team, and so he could go look at our systems and figure out where we could take advantage of it. And what we ran into was the resistance from the compliance people to, automating these tasks. Have you seen that? And if so, how did that get addressed?
Yeah, so the reason the compliance people get upset is because the core data that the algorithm is looking at is probably not reliable. A lot of companies I worked with classify it once, forget it. Then some companies say, oh yeah, every 2 years we run a scrub of our data to try to see if we misclassified something or rules changed or the tariff numbers changed. It's a very difficult project to undertake or process. So bad data or unreliable data might be a better description, is the number one reason that compliance professionals do not trust AI or some of the automation solutions to be as compliant as they would be, because they can physically see the anomaly in the data versus a system that's out there doing things without them supervising it. I think that's the problem.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I've seen that over and over. You and I have talked a lot about this, and you know how enthusiastic I am about digitalization of trade functions. And I'm just curious, do you think that this digitalization of trade is a dream, or do you think there is a path to reach this nirvana?
I think it's a hybrid of that question. I think that, again, if companies focus on the data and they focus on reducing the number of systems that they have within their companies, all those interfaces, all the languages, all the regulations in different countries, and getting all that together is a challenge. And so I really believe that you automate where possible. You set a goal of the transactions that can go through, and that's your story to management. And then everything else you use your experienced people for.
I see. Yeah. I kind of feel like I think the other part of the equation to reach that sort of nirvana, if you will, is the government. Because if the governments aren't capable or willing, then it's hard to have a handshake, if you will.
No, totally agree there. I was also working on another project with a company that we were trying to work, and actually Intel was a big part of it, to do some blockchain work, to be able to get documents for cross-border transactions in and out of various countries. And the number one challenge were the governments and their capabilities and their interest in doing this as well. It's just not there.
What do you think it would take to get them there?
I think, I don't know. I haven't thought of that. How do we get there? And I'm a person that usually doesn't have that hesitation, because it's a very huge task. And so again, I'm a make a sandwich type person. You pick the things that you can do, focus. I mean, the UK and some other parts of Europe might be very capable. I know that Intel had a project in Vietnam, I believe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And but I don't know whatever happened to that project. If it's continued, or it was just a proof of concept.
It was a proof of concept, and it's probably still somewhat ongoing. But I think the challenge with governments is most of the Western countries, Europe, US, Canada, have systems that work quite well, as you've described. I think the opportunity probably is going into places that are not as robust, places around the world, like in Latin America or Africa, and places where you might be able to come in and get governments to see the value of starting from the beginning with digital solutions. So anyway, it's something I will have to continue to look at. Yes, there you go. So Karen, to avoid enforcement challenges, we both agree with the importance of effective compliance programs, automated systems, and good talent. What about the organization itself? In your experience, is there an optimal place in the company for the trade group to report under?
So it just depends on, again, the company and the complexity. My teams thrived the best when we were under tax or finance because those are the teams that typically know what's going on in the company before the legal department does, with respect to opportunities for new products, opportunities for new locations. Everybody goes to tax first. How much is this going to cost me? So then just being there in the tax department, we would get the similar questions. What are the challenges importing and exporting? What free trade agreements are available? Questions like that, that when I worked in a legal department, it was more the reaction. We set up in Vietnam or we set up in Costa Rica, but everything's stuck at the border. We didn't know that we needed to file a business permit to do this activity, or we didn't understand the ASEAN free trade agreement, or that we have to get approval from the Malaysian government before we can implement a cross-border manufacturing program. You know, people, they knew that they had to do it, but they didn't know what it would cost if they didn't. So I think that I thrived personally in a tax or a finance reporting to like chief financial officer, where again, we would see the projects before, proactive. In legal, I felt, and I've reported to legal twice in my career, and in both cases it was more reaction. We've got a shipment stuck, get it out. Or, you know, we're in Vietnam, how do we get a bonded manufacturing program going? So anyway, I know people can't see my face, but I just like cringed at having to clean up rather than be proactive.
Yeah.
Is how I feel in a legal department.
Sure.
I'm being honest. That's why we're here, right?
Right. No, I really appreciate those thoughts because I spent 25 years in finance and tax, and then we were moved into the legal department. And then we were moved into government affairs. So I've seen the dynamics across all three of those, for example, and I agree with you. My conclusion, I think, was that I don't know if it ultimately matters, because whether you're at legal or government affairs or finance, you have to compensate for what you're missing, as you said. So if I'm in finance, I've got to go figure out the legal piece, or the government affairs, how do I engage? If I'm in government affairs, I got to connect with finance. So I think at the end of the day, having close relationships with all parties in the company, and I think as a trade organization, you have to, wherever you sit. You know, over my career at Intel, I had the opportunity to build 4 different trade teams, and one of the struggles I had trying to figure out the best option was, how do I best organize the resources? So for example, is a centralized team better, or is it better to align the resources according to the local leadership? Do you have experience in either of those, and any lessons that we can take?
Yeah, so I have a couple different organizations that I've built in my career, and one that I'm seeing more often now is global trade being a service provider, setting up the IT solution, providing the classification data, interpreting the regulations and developing policy, and even some high-level process with the business and operations. That is sort of a trend I'm seeing as more and more global trade functions report to legal. Is kind of a way to do that. Trying to get team members in global trade to volunteer for cross-functional projects, or to even seek them out, participate in, like I used to have one of my team members was involved very heavily in what was called like the engineering advisory board at Applied Materials, and we would have a little booth at the engineering conference about global trade. Yeah. And then at Flex one time, we set up our own pop-ups, and we had products that Flex was building in various jurisdictions, and we had a little quiz about how much the duty was if you made that like a curling iron in one country and shipped it to another, or we made Nespresso machines, and what were some of the trade considerations there, like marking requirements. I mean, different things. We did a little pop-up, and if people came, they got like a cookie or a churro, and it was, just getting us out there was a big part of my kind of DNA.
Right. I've seen models where trade employees do both customs and export, and then I've seen others where they're segregated by their expertise or their functions. Have you seen those models, and what are your thoughts on
A
that?
lot of companies are set up very siloed between export and customs. I used to be in that business model. At one point, but I went back and forth. So one of my jobs I started as export manager. Another job I started as customs manager. And then I said, why are we doing this? My export is your import. So I believe that, again, the team members thrive if they're capable of doing both and analyzing both and delivering both. So there's also another choice, which is regional. So having a regional structure where you have a leader maybe for Europe, Asia, the Americas, and then you might have an administrative function that does some of that service, like I said, the IT and classifications for everyone. So there's a lot of different ways that global trade can be set up to achieve the business goals. You just have to figure out what model fits.
Right. Yeah, I think that's kind of been my experience as well. It depends on your business, depends on how you're organized around the world.
I just thought of something though. When you talk about separating customs and exports, typically a lot of companies, the customs function will report and stay in tax because it's considered an indirect tax. Then export, because there's a lot of regulatory, there's lists, there's licenses, things like that, then the export function and sanctions gets moved over to legal. And so that is something that can be done as well. And several companies have been that way forever. But I'm more of a hands-on type of a practitioner, so I like having all the transactions available and figure out the solution.
You are currently an executive advisor, and in previous roles you've shared that you were a vice president. Thinking about those who are working in trade, can you share how did this come about? How did you get to those levels? What does it take? Any advice for folks that are getting started?
Yeah, so I think number one, you have to decide your brand. You and I have talked about this before. We are known for getting things done. That we have a very similar brand that anyone who employs us or asks us to help out knows that they'll give us a problem statement, we'll analyze it, and we'll figure out a path to solving it. The other thing I think people have to think about is what is the return on a company investing in you? You know, they're going to offer you, you're going to make a salary. What value will they get out of it? And a good example, I see a lot of people putting in their resume, they manage the drawback program. But I don't see a number. Like how much money are you getting from the drawback program? Or you're managing a foreign trade zone. How much money are you mitigating due to that process? But in both programs, there is a cost. It's, running a foreign trade zone is very expensive, but compared to the amount of duties that you're mitigating, that's the number. Not the pure duty savings number, but what is the real ROI to a company? And one thing I always avoid is saying that I avoided sanctions and penalties, because that really is what you're supposed to be thinking about. But going back to what is the return on the investment, whether it's bonded manufacturing programs. I had a huge maquiladora program that I worked with our partners in Flex in Mexico, and the China ebook process, just different programs that really brought value for my whole team as a ROI to the company.
Right. Now that's music to my ears because I basically operated the same sort of program at Intel. In fact, when I left Intel, one of my pieces of advice that I gave the team was, as long as you deliver value, concrete value, you will continue to have that C-suite visibility. As soon as you don't, you will become irrelevant. And I think that's it's so important that we're not just there to adhere to the rules, but we're there to actually help the company grow. So, well, Karen, this has been just a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else you would like to discuss or anything else about compliance or enforcement that you want to share with the listeners today?
Yes, I just have one final challenge to your audience, Jeff, and that is to really think about AI and other automation solutions that can really help move the majority of transactions along. And if folks have any thoughts about sanction party screening, classification, or even the creation of some of the documentation that's required, what is their nirvana with respect to reducing the bureaucracy of the trade function?
Yeah, I think that's a great challenge, Karen. I think every one of our listeners should pay attention to that challenge, because at the end of the day, trade is still operating the way it was for the last 50 to 100 years, very paper intensive, and there's an opportunity with the technology we have today to really make a huge difference, to streamline, make it more cost effective and more efficient. So I think that's a spot on challenge for our listeners.
Yes, I hope they contact you.
Yes, well, you've given me an idea for maybe a podcast to focus on that, and I have a few people in mind that could really provide some good input on this topic. So
Perfect. This has been fun.
yeah, thank you once again for joining me and for your thoughts and your wise advice, and appreciate it very much. Thank you. Okay, well, I hope everyone enjoyed listening to that conversation I had with Karen as much as I did. It was wonderful just to get so many good thoughts and ideas from Karen from her many years of experience. I also appreciate her challenge to all of you to bring to me any thoughts and ideas you have about digitizing trade. I'm very passionate about that topic. And so if you'd like to reach out to me, you can at jeff@rittenerreflections.com. Again, jeff@rittenerreflections.com. And so hope to hear from many of you, and we'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you very much.